Welcome back to the deep dive. I was actually scrolling through the business news this morning.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just sipping my coffee, and it really kind of hit me that we are just absolutely obsessed with the scoreboard of
The
nations.
scoreboard, you mean like the Olympics or something?
No, I mean like the global economic rankings. It's always, China's economy is surging or the US is leading the pack.
Or Germany is slowing down.
Right. We treat countries exactly like sports teams. And the only stat that seems to matter to anyone is how much cash they have in the bank.
It is kind of the ultimate trap, honestly. We tend to just assume that a wealthy country is automatically a successful country.
Which makes sense on the surface.
It does, but we equate the size of the national wallet with the actual well-being of the humans living there, and that's dangerous.
Right. If the GDP is high, you just assume everyone must be living the good life. But that's exactly the misconception we are blowing up today.
Let's do it.
We're digging into a big stack of research on metrics and indices of global development. And for you listening, this is specifically looking at AP human geography concepts, really unpacking how the experts view the world.
Which, I will admit, sounds a little dry on the surface. I mean,
Hmm.
indices isn't exactly a party
It
starter,
sounds terrible. It sounds like a math textbook.
but it's not.
No, it's not. Once you actually get into the source material, it's honestly like a detective story. Because it turns out the numbers we see on the news every night, like GDP or the stock market, they can be incredibly misleading.
They are essentially a filter on a photo that hides all the blemishes.
Exactly. They hide poverty, they hide inequality, they hide the fact that in some supposedly wealthy nations, the average person is barely scraping by.
So that's really our mission today. We're going to decode this whole alphabet soup,
The GDP, GNI, HDI.
all of it. We need to figure out how geographers actually classify the world, into the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery.
And why looking at just the money is often the absolute worst way to understand what's happening.
So let's start with the usual suspects, the big economic indicators.
Yeah, let's start there. The research makes a really interesting distinction right off the bat between location versus citizenship. It feels almost like a legal distinction, but it changes everything about how we count a country's money.
It really does.
Yeah.
This is the fundamental difference between asking where's the money made and asking who actually owns the money.
And the big daddy of them all here is GDP, gross domestic product. That's the one everyone and their mother knows.
A headline grabber.
The way I've always thought about GDP, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, is that it's essentially house rules.
House rules, I like that.
Right. It measures the total value of all the goods and services produced inside a country's borders,
Inside the house.
inside the house. It doesn't matter who owns the factory. If a Japanese car company builds a plant in Kentucky, that production counts toward America's GDP because it's happening on our turf.
Precisely. GDP is strictly geographical. If the widget is made on your soil, it goes on your scoreboard. And for a really long time, this was the gold standard. If you were producing a lot of stuff, you were doing well. But there's a massive flaw here.
Especially when we talk about developing nations.
Exactly. Because of where the profit ultimately goes. Let's just create a hypothetical scenario to make it clear.
Okay.
Imagine a developing country. Let's call it Country X. Now, Country X is super rich in natural resources. A massive multinational corporation from a wealthy core country comes in.
They set up shop.
Right. They set up a mine, they bring in their own heavy machinery, their own management, and they extract millions of dollars worth of copper.
Okay, so on paper, Country X is suddenly producing millions of dollars in new value. Their GDP just spikes.
It looks fantastic on paper. But who owns the mine?
The foreign corporation.
The foreign corporation.
Yeah.
So where do those profits go? They don't stay in Country X to build schools or roads. They are repatriated right back to the headquarters in the wealthy country.
Wow. So GDP tells us the country is busy, but it doesn't actually tell us if the country is getting richer.
Spot on. It measures activity, it does not measure income. And that's exactly why geographers and economists needed a second metric, which is GNP, gross national product.
And this is where that citizenship rule comes into play.
Yes. GNP completely flips the script. It counts the total value of goods and services produced by a country's citizens and their corporations.
Regardless of where they are physically located on the planet?
Exactly. It focuses on ownership, not geography.
Okay, so in our mining example, the profits from that copper mine in country X would actually count toward the GNP of the wealthy country that owns the corporation.
Correct. So it gives a slightly clearer picture of who is actually getting the money.
Okay, so we have GDP, which is location, and GNP, which is ownership. But looking at the deep dive material, it suggests that neither of these is actually the favorite for economists analyzing the developing world right now.
No, they prefer a third acronym, GNI.
Gross national income.
Yes. If you really want to understand the reality of a developing economy today, GNI is the metric you need to be watching.
So why is GNI the golden child? What is it catching that the other two are missing?
It captures the flow of actual cash that is available to the country. GNI is essentially your GDP, what you made at home, plus your net income from abroad.
Okay, so what does that include?
It includes interest payments, dividends from foreign investments, and this is the really crucial part for developing nations' remittances.
Remittances. Okay, I want to pause on that word because the sources highlighted it as a huge deal. That's when people who are working overseas send money back home to their families, right?
It is a massive factor. Think about a country like the Philippines or various parts of Central America. You might have a very significant percentage of your workforce living in the U.S. or the Middle East or Europe,
And they are working there, earning wages in euros or dollars.
earning strong currency and sending a portion of that cash straight back to their families in their home country.
And that money is real, spendable income. It buys food, it builds houses, it pays for school fees.
Exactly. GDP misses that money completely because the physical work happened overseas, but GNI catches it. It tells you how much income the nation actually has available to spend in the local economy.
It almost feels like GNI is the take-home pay of a country, whereas GDP is just the top-line sales revenue.
That is a fantastic analogy. It's what actually ends up in the pocket. But, and here's the big caveat, even GNI can absolutely lie to you.
Of course it can. Nothing in economics is ever that simple.
Well, think about it rationally. GNI is just a total cumulative number. It's a big pile of cash. You can easily have a country with a skyrocketing GNI, but the actual people on the street are starving.
Right, so economists usually try to fix this by doing those per capita calculations. You take
Okay.
the total GNI and divide it by the population.
Right, to find the average income,
But the sources warn about the per capita trap.
because it is just a mathematical average. And averages are notorious for masking reality. They completely hide the extremes.
The source material brought up the Brazil example here, which I found just really shocking.
Brazil is the classic case study for this exact problem.
So Brazil has a massive economy. It's a global powerhouse, huge GNI. If you just looked at the average income, you'd think, hey, everyone in Brazil is doing pretty well.
It looks like a very solid, comfortable middle-income life on paper.
But the data shows that the top 1% of the population holds nearly 50% of the entire nation's wealth.
Right. Now think about what that wealth concentration does to a mathematical average. It skews it completely. It's the old joke. If Bill Gates walks into a dive bar, on average, everyone in that bar is now a millionaire.
But nobody in the bar can actually afford to buy a round of drinks.
Exactly. Their day-to-day reality hasn't changed one bit. And this is the per capita trap. In many developing nations, and let's be honest, in the US and the UK as well, wealth is heavily hoarded by a tiny elite class.
So the GNI per capita looks incredibly healthy on a spreadsheet, but the person walking down the street sees literally none of it.
None of it.
So how do we actually measure that gap? If the average is a lie, what's the truth teller?
For that, geographers use a tool called the Gini coefficient,
GINI.
named after the Italian statistician Corrado Gini. It specifically measures this distribution spread. Imagine a scale from 0 to 1, or sometimes you'll see it written as 0 to 100.
Okay, let's break down that scale. What is a 0?
A score of 0 represents absolute, perfect equality. Every single person in the country earns the exact same amount of money.
The utopia score. Or maybe the Star Trek score, where money doesn't matter.
Right. And on the other end, a score of 1 or 100 means one single person has all the money and everyone else has literally 0.
The ultimate dictator score.
The dictator score. So, realistically, countries sit somewhere in the middle. Developed core countries, think Scandinavia or parts of Western Europe, they tend to have much lower Gini scores, maybe in the 20s or low 30s.
Which implies they have a strong middle class, and the wealth is being shared somewhat broadly across the population.
It's exactly. The United States is actually a bit of an outlier for a rich nation. Its Gini coefficient is higher, usually somewhere in the 40s, which indicates significantly more wealth inequality.
And what about the periphery? The developing world?
That's where you see the real danger zones. Scores up in the 50s or 60s. South Africa, for example, has historically had one of the absolute highest Gini coefficients in the world.
And I have to assume a high Gini score isn't just a math problem on a chalkboard. It fundamentally changes the vibe and safety of a country.
Completely. High inequality almost universally correlates with social instability, much higher crime rates, and a severe lack of public trust.
It's the difference between a society where people willingly pay taxes for shared parks and transit and a society of walled-off gated communities surrounded by slums.
Which brings us to a massive blind spot in all these economic numbers we've been talking about so far. We've only been discussing money that gets tracked, taxed, and recorded. The formal economy.
The stuff the government actually knows about. But there's a whole other economy out there, isn't there?
The shadow economy.
This was easily my favorite part of the reading. It feels like this entire hidden world operating right under our noses. But before we get deep into the shadow economy, we probably need to understand the job structure first, right? Because the actual type of jobs people do tells you a lot about where a country sits in its development.
It does. Think of it like an evolutionary ladder of economics. We break economic activity down into sectors. Right at the base, you have the primary sector. This is extracting raw things from the earth. Farming, mining, forestry, fishing.
So if 70% of your population is farming, you're almost certainly a developing nation.
Generally speaking, yes. Then as a country develops, you move up to the secondary sector, which is manufacturing, taking that iron ore from the primary sector and turning it into a car.
Then comes the tertiary sector.
Services, selling the car, banking, retail, teaching, nursing.
And the sources mention a fourth one, which honestly sounds very sci-fi.
The quaternary sector. This is the pure knowledge economy.
What actually falls into that bucket?
Research and development, high-level data processing, complex financial consulting. Think about teams coding a new artificial intelligence app in Silicon Valley, or scientists developing an mRNA vaccine.
So they are creating massive value from pure information and intellect, not from raw physical materials.
Correct. So the standard progression of development is basically moving your workforce from the farm, which is primary, to the factory, secondary to the office, tertiary, and finally to the lab, quaternary.
That's the ideal path. But there is a wrinkle.
A huge wrinkle. In developing nations, the formal economy, meaning the registered tax-paying jobs in factories and offices, often isn't nearly big enough to employ everyone. There just aren't enough official jobs to go around.
But people still have to eat. They have to survive.
So they create their own jobs
Yeah.
out of necessity, and this creates the informal sector.
The gray market.
Exactly. This is economic activity that operates completely outside of government oversight. There are no taxes, there are no safety regulations, there is no paper trail whatsoever.
Yeah. The sources listed some examples that are really common and recognizable. Street vendors selling tacos, unlicensed taxi drivers, undocumented construction labor. Even basic things like babysitting for cash or fixing a neighbor's car in your driveway for $50.
It sounds totally harmless when you use an example like babysitting. But when you look at the macro data, the scale of this is just staggering. In wealthy core countries, the informal sector is maybe 10 or 15% of the economy. It's there, but it's mostly on the fringe.
But in the periphery.
In the periphery, it can be nearly 50% of the entire economic value of the country.
Wait, 50%?
Yes. Literally half the country's daily work is completely invisible to the state.
That is wild. Because if GDP and GNI rely on government data and tax records and half the economy is invisible,
Then your GDP and GNI numbers are just fundamentally wrong. They are drastically undercounting the true economic activity happening in developing nations. The country is vastly busier than the official numbers say it is.
okay, I have to play devil's advocate for a second here. Isn't there a massive downside to this? I mean, sure, the street vendor is making cash to feed his family, which is good for him, but what about the country as a whole?
The downside is catastrophic. It is a classic development trap. If 50% of your economy isn't paying a dime in taxes, the government has virtually no revenue stream.
And no revenue means...
No revenue means you cannot build roads. You cannot fund public schools. You cannot maintain sanitation or hospitals. You can't even reliably pay police officers.
So it's a vicious cycle. You have a large informal sector because the economy is weak, but the economy stays permanently weak because the government can't invest in infrastructure because they can't collect taxes.
Precisely. And for the workers themselves, it's incredibly dangerous. There are absolutely no legal protections. If a construction worker gets hurt on an undocumented job, there's no workers' compensation.
There's no minimum wage.
None. It is pure, unregulated survival mode. So a massive informal sector is almost always a glaring red flag for a lower level of development.
So if we step back, we've pretty well established that the money metrics are incredibly messy. They ignore wealth inequality with the Gini problem, and they totally ignore the guy selling fruit on the corner with the informal economy problem.
Which is exactly why the leading experts decided we need to stop just looking at the national wallet and start looking at the actual human beings.
This is the big shift to social and demographic indicators. We have to stop asking how rich is the country and start asking what is the actual quality of life for the person living there.
Exactly. And the sources highlight a few key demographic indicators here. They act almost like dominoes. One heavily affects the next. Let's start with fertility rates.
Right, the average number of children a woman will have during her childbearing years. There is basically a universal rule in development geography here. As development rises, fertility drops.
Always.
Why is that link so unbreakable? Is it purely about access to modern contraception?
That's certainly part of it. But the biggest single driver is what sociologists often call the education contraceptive. When women have robust access to higher education and actual career opportunities, they naturally tend to delay marriage and have fewer children.
They invest more resources into each child rather than having a large number of kids.
Exactly. Conversely, in the periphery, where educational opportunities for women are scarce and where children might be needed for agricultural labor, fertility rates remain very high, often 4 or 5 children per woman, compared to maybe 1.6 in the core countries.
And high fertility obviously strains the resources of both the family and the state, which perfectly ties into the next major indicator, the infant mortality rate, or IMR.
Deaths per 1,000 live births. I will tell you, this is, in my opinion, the single most telling statistic you can possibly look at. If you only look at one number to judge a country, make it this one.
Why? Why is IMR more important than, say, overall life expectancy?
Because the infant mortality rate is the ultimate canary in the coal mine. It acts as a proxy for the entire structural integrity of a nation. Think about it. To keep a fragile newborn baby alive through its first year of life, you need a whole cascade of things to go right.
You need clean drinking water.
You need clean water. You need functional sanitation systems. You need reliable access to a trained doctor or midwife. You need a mother who is well-nourished and educated enough to spot warning signs.
So if the IMR is low, it essentially proves that the entire underlying system works.
Yes, you cannot fake a low infant mortality rate. You just can't. It requires a truly functioning society. If babies are dying at high rates, it cuts through all the economic noise. It means the water is dirty, the hospitals are failing, or the food supply is deeply insecure.
Wow, that makes total sense. Then the sources bring up literacy rates, which seems pretty straightforward. Can your population read and write?
It measures human capital. If your population is functionally illiterate, you absolutely cannot participate in that quaternary knowledge economy we talked about earlier. You are permanently stuck in the primary sector, just digging things out of the ground.
One outlier in the demographic list that actually surprised me was energy use per capita. I really didn't expect to see light bulbs listed right alongside babies and literacy.
It is an interesting one. It's essentially a measure of national muscle. Developed nations are incredibly energy hungry. We use massive amounts of power for heavy transportation, industrial manufacturing, climate control, and server farms for computing.
So it indicates industrial maturity.
It does. Now, obviously, it also raises huge questions about global sustainability because developed nations are historically the biggest polluters. We can't ignore that. But strictly as an AP human geography development metric, high energy use directly equals high development.
So if you're keeping track at home, we have all these puzzle pieces just scattered on the table now. We have the economic numbers, which we know are flawed, and the demographic numbers, which tell a totally different story. It seems like it would be incredibly hard to actually compare countries when you have 20 different competing variables.
It is practically impossible, which is exactly why the global experts created composite indices.
The mashups.
The mashups. Instead of looking at just money over here or just health over there, let's combine multiple data points into a single comprehensive score to get a truly holistic view.
The first composite index mentioned in the stack is the GII, the Gender Inequality Index.
This one is absolutely crucial. This index operates on a very simple, undeniable premise. You cannot possibly be a fully developed nation if you are systematically holding back half your team.
It measures the gap in development between men and women. What are the specific components they mash together for this score?
It's essentially a three-legged stool. First, reproductive health. Are women dying in childbirth? Are adolescents having kids? This tells us a lot about how the healthcare system treats women specifically. Second is empowerment.
Meaning political power.
Political and intellectual. Do women hold seats in the national government? And do they have equal access to higher education?
And the third leg.
Labor market participation. Are women actually allowed and encouraged to work in the formal paying economy?
And the general rule of thumb for the GII score.
It's an inverse relationship. The higher your gender inequality score, the lower your overall national development. It acts essentially as a massive efficiency tax on your entire economy. If you don't let women work or study, you are intentionally wasting 50% of your nation's brain power. You can't compete globally like that.
Which brings us to the final boss of development metrics, the one that the United Nations created to basically settle this whole argument once and for all, the HDI.
The Human Development Index.
This feels like the grand unifying theory of development geography.
It really is. And it was created specifically by the UN to counter the world's unhealthy obsession with GDP. The core philosophy behind the HDI is what makes it so powerful. It operates on the radical belief that a strong economy is actually not the goal.
Wait, an economist saying the economy isn't the goal? That sounds like heresy on Wall Street.
Not the end goal. The economy is merely a tool. The actual goal of human development is to provide choices.
Choice.
Yes, a wealthy country should provide a stable environment where its people can choose to be healthy, choose to be educated, and choose to have a decent, safe standard of living. If all that national money doesn't translate into those choices for the average person, the money is practically useless.
So how does the HDI actually measure choices on a spreadsheet?
It combines three specific dimensions we've touched on today. Number one, a long and healthy life, which they measure by life expectancy at birth. Number two, knowledge. They measure this by looking at the expected years of schooling for kids today, plus the mean years of schooling that adults already have.
And the third piece.
A decent standard of living, which is measured by our old friend, GNI per capita.
So it's health plus education plus money, the trifecta.
Correct. And this synthesis completely changes the map of the world. This is exactly why you can have a country with massive, sprawling oil reserves, meaning their GNI is absolutely through the roof, but they still rank surprisingly low on the HDI.
Because they have the money, but they haven't turned that money into choices for the people.
Exactly. If the oil money is hoarded by a ruling elite, and the public schools are empty, and the hospitals are broken, their HDI will tank. It beautifully exposes the difference between a rich government and a rich life for the citizens.
That is such a powerful distinction. High HDI means better choices and higher standards of living across the board. Low HDI means deep, systemic challenges across all three sectors.
It forces world leaders to look beyond the stock market ticker. You can't cheat the HDI as easily as you can cheat GDP. You can't just dig more holes in the ground and sell the copper. To raise your HDI, you actually have to build the schools and staff the clinics.
You know, this has really changed how I'm going to look at the news from now on. We constantly hear China's GDP is growing or India's economy is surging, but now I realize that is just one single clue in a much larger mystery.
You really have to look at the whole dashboard. You have to ask, okay, GDP is up, but is the Gini coefficient rising too? Is the informal sector shrinking? Is the gender inequality index actually improving?
Being a well-informed global citizen means being deeply skeptical of the single headline number.
Always. Economic growth is totally meaningless if it's not inclusive. If the national pie gets bigger, but the slices don't actually get passed out to the people, the country isn't really developing, it's just inflating.
That's a really powerful thought to end on. It honestly makes me wonder about our own definitions of success, even just in our personal lives.
It definitely should. You know, if we accept the whole philosophy of the HDI, that the sole purpose of a strong economy is just to provide choices, it raises a really provocative question for everyone listening right now.
Oh, I love a provocative question. What is it?
Should we stop viewing economic growth as the destination? Maybe we should view it merely as the fuel, because you can have a completely full tank of gas, a massive GDP, but if you don't have a steering wheel or a map, meaning education and health, you aren't actually going anywhere. So next time you see a ranking of the top economies, ask yourself, are they actually successful, or do they just have a lot of gas in a car that's stuck in the mud?
Fuel versus destination. I love that analogy. Thank you so much for helping us decode the numbers today.
It was my absolute pleasure.
And to everyone listening, keep asking questions, and whatever you do, don't just trust the headline number. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.